Hello, this week is week number 6, and we're going to be discussing women of color and domestic violence. When I talk about women of color, I want to make sure that it is understood that it does not mean Black or African American women. What women of color means is any person who is not of Western European origin, or quite simply, any person who is African American, Black, Asian, Hispanic, you name it, who is not actually white, okay? I know it's very difficult to think of women of color and not think of exclusively Black women, okay? They're the largest group of oppressed society in our society, women of color, okay? So we're talking about women being a group of women or a sex that's being oppressed. But then when we just think about women alone, of all the different races and ethnicities that make up the population of just women, there are women of color who make up the largest group of oppression, or the largest group of oppressed people in our society. They are more oppressed than other women are, okay? So a white woman will hold more privilege in our society than a woman of color, although a white woman does not have the same privileges as, say, a white man, okay? Or if we talk about men for a brief moment, a Black man who might have less privilege than a white man, but he holds more privilege than a woman of color simply by the fact that he is male, okay? So there's all of these different dynamics when we think about gender and color, as well as the race that it comes from. At the bottom of the social hierarchy that I was just talking about is always going to be Black women who are lesbians. Because in our society, the quote, way to be is, or the heteronormative is the way to be. So if you are not heterosexual and you are not white and you are not male, that means you are a Black woman lesbian, the very bottom of our social hierarchy. And I understand the social hierarchy takes into many considerations, not just gender, race, and sex, or gender is something, race and sex, okay? But for our discussion purposes, those are the things to kind of symbolize it and to help you understand what we're talking about when we're talking in this terms of the social hierarchy. The interesting thing that I've noticed that is not in any academic source is a thing called internal hegemony. But before we talk about internal hegemony, I want to talk about hegemony. Okay, hegemony is a social system of power. It can be a person, it can be a system of government, or it can be several people in power, like a committee. In our discussion, we're just going to kind of keep it simple. When we're going to talk about hegemony, we're just going to talk about white males. In our society, white men hold a lot of privilege. They're at the top of the social hierarchy. And for hundreds of years, they have known themselves to be the gender and the sex and the class to have the most privilege, okay? And because they understand that and they know that, they tend to pretty much dictate how things go, okay? And that's why we have to have those men in our history holding higher offices or higher positions of authority or power. So they control and they hold the power. So let's transition into internal hegemony. When there are women, and we're just going to talk about women only, they're already oppressed by simply being women. But white women over here and women of color over here, because of the fact that they are white, they hold more privilege than these women over here who are not white. And sometimes we see in our society white women overpowering or dominating women of color. And so what's very interesting is they will perpetuate their own oppression. So what we have is women who are already in an oppressed category or class oppressing their own kind, internal, right? By their power struggle or the power distance that they have. So they're taking their power that they have for just being white and exerting that onto women who are not white to further oppress women just simply because they are not white. And I believe the reason why that happens is because white women recognize they hold less power in our society, yet they want power, and it's harder to gain it or get equal footing among white men. So they go to what is the easier place to get that power or to exert that power, which is other women or women of color. Okay, so it's an interesting term that I came up with when I was in graduate school about a dozen years ago, because I was thinking about the social hierarchy and I was thinking about hegemony, and like, wow, here is an oppressed group oppressing an oppressed group, right? So that was kind of interesting. So we need to talk about race versus ethnicity. Ethnicity is where someone comes from, like a country or a region. Like my mother's Vietnamese, so I'm Asian. I was born in Asia and I'm pretty much Asian. I identify as Asian. But my race I get so confused. My ethnicity is Vietnam or whatever, but my race is Asian, okay? So my ethnicity is I am a Vietnamese person from the Asian race. I apologize. I get confused when I talk about that all the time. And I know the difference. I apologize. I know the difference, but when I try to explain it, it comes out wrong. Sometimes I have to actually hear myself to catch that. So once again, so you're not confused. Ethnicity is where the person comes from, like the country that they're from. And race is kind of like the region or how they were described, like Asian or white or black, okay? African American would be the ethnicity. Race would be black, okay? And the reason why that's important is because we need to know that race is a social construct. It was developed a long time ago, I think in the 40s, or even earlier than that, to help our society understand and make sense of who someone is. And it was created as a means to identify people for census numbers and where people are living or whatever. But it has become a tool to segregate and to discriminate and to provide injustices to people as well as prejudice. And what happens is we think of race and we think of white and black or Hispanic or Asian. And in our society, we rank those races by best to least or best to worst or favorite to least favorite or best to least favorite or best to worst, or I don't know. We rank them, right? And it's all socially constructed. And the ranking is done by people who are participating in that race, okay? And sometimes it can lead to discrimination in education, in the workforce, or even in the social justice system. Just look around and watch the news. You can see that a college boy, white boy, who might be maybe 21 or 22, could get drunk one night and sexually assault a woman. And he goes to trial, and the lawyer says, think about his history, or his future. If we convict him, he will not have a chance at his future, and he made a mistake. Have some grace, be easy on him, and he might get off with just probation for 2 years, or community service, or whatever it is. Okay, like a little slap on the wrist. A black man, the same age, in college, does the same exact thing, he might get some jail time. And now all of a sudden, he has a conviction of a felony on his record, which makes it so much more difficult for him in his future to get a job, or to get housing, or to get credit. So there are disparities there when we talk about race and how it can be very prejudicial, discriminatory. Okay, so we need to understand those things and not think about race in terms of how we can divide our society, but in terms of how we can take that and say, embrace that and have everybody come together and be a cohesive social unit. The other thing I'll talk about is economic inequality. There are a lot of people or individuals who suffer economically because of their race and the color of their skin. And I tend to think that a lot of that prejudice comes from white people who are the ones in power making decisions about applications or whatever it is. So there is a lot of economic inequality that happens among people of color. Career advancement is another problem. Black women or women of color do not advance at the same pace as their white female counterparts or just their white counterparts, male or female, period. Okay, women of color don't hold as many offices in higher levels than white people do or white men do. So those are things to understand. Again, going back to healthcare, our last conversation last week, yes, we have to think about healthcare as another place where there's disparities, okay? Again, just to reiterate that. I want to move on to domestic violence and understand that domestic violence is not always performed by a male. To put that out there. Men can be victims of domestic violence, although there's a greater number of cases where domestic violence is where the male is the perpetrator, okay, and the violence is being performed on a woman. So what happens when we have domestic violence? How can we define that? It's not always physical, okay? It can be emotional violence by telling somebody that they're not good enough, or I don't understand why you're going to college, you're not going to get a job, or things like that. It can be verbal in terms of insulting them constantly, okay? Verbal insults can be calling them foul language, using foul language to say things to them, insulting them, mimicking them, or even threatening them. Those are other ways that domestic violence can happen, okay? It's not always physical. Domestic violence is about controlling behavior, trying to control the behavior of the person who's the victim. It's like saying, if you behave or you do as I tell you or don't put pepper in my steak or whatever that person likes, you said, if you do that, we're not going to have a problem. You won't get beat up again or you won't get slapped. Okay, so if you don't want to get slapped, then do what I tell you to do. It's about control. It's never about power or showing how strong they are. It's about trying to control somebody, okay? And sometimes in the form of domestic violence, it can be sexual in nature, and it's forced sex. So domestic violence, when it's forced sex, leads to what we know as rape, okay? And rape is an unwanted sexual advance, physical or non-physical, because it can be verbal, because sexual assault can be verbal by constantly saying things about a person's body or body parts, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. It can also be controlling someone's finances. Say, okay, I'm only going to give you this much money, even though they're the ones that made the money. They take all their money and then give back like $200 a week. My brother was in a domestic violence situation, not physical. He worked a 40-hour-a-week job and got paid, and then his partner at one point when they became husbands. So his husband would take all of the money and then give him a certain dollar amount that he deemed was necessary for him to survive for the 2 weeks until he got paid again. And we asked, my mother and I used to ask him, why do you allow him to do that to you? Oh, he's not doing it to me. I give him the money. You give him the money? Yeah, because I don't know how to manage it well. So that's how they hide it, or they cover it up by saying, I'm helping you manage your money better. But they were always in a financial mess. Even though his husband was taking his money, he wasn't managing his money either. Well, so those are things you have to think about. That when someone puts money on an allowance or don't allow them to spend the money they want the way they want them, it's not all about trying to manage the household goods or the funds. It can also be a form of control. Okay? Psychological abuse and manipulation, that's a form of domestic violence. By stalking them can also be a form of domestic violence. So by doing things like psychological abuse, saying things like, I don't know why you buy that makeup, it doesn't make you any prettier. Or I've had people say to me, which is not quite the same thing, but you know, you look better if you just dyed your hair back to black. Things like that. If you hear that constantly over and over and over again, that's abuse. Okay, if you hear people saying bad things and the same things over and over again, that's a form of abuse, and it's also a form of domestic violence. I forgot to say, domestic violence doesn't have to be a husband and wife who are married. It can be a male and female who are in a committed relationship. It can be a male and male in a committed relationship or married. It can be female and female in a committed relationship or married. It's any domestic, anybody, any two people or a couple who share a household or share the way they live, okay? And if they're sharing a physical space like a home or apartment or whatever that may mean, and if any sort of violence is happening, then that's a form of domestic violence. Why do so many domestic violence cases go unreported? Because the first time a woman reports her domestic violence against her perpetrator, they hold them, the police come and they take them away. They hold them for 24 hours. And then when they go back home, they're in more trouble because they said, I can't believe you called the police on me and had me sit in jail for 24 hours. And that escalates into another fight or verbal argument or even physical argument. So a lot of domestic violence cases go unreported because the fear of the retaliation of what will happen when they come back. Sometimes domestic violence goes too far and it goes on for too long, like years. We're talking years here. We're not talking like 2 or 3 weeks. We're talking years, like 3 or 4 years or more, or even sometimes less. It depends on what point does the woman decide that she's had enough and she reacts. And when she reacts, it's pretty violent. Either she kills the person or she beats them up or something very violent. And then the police are called or they come to the scene. She's taken to prison because of what she did. And they never say, well, look at the history. What happened to make her do this? They don't look at that. It's always the victim's fault for reacting to the violence. And that's another thing that has to be turned around. We need to understand psychology when we're talking about domestic violence and understand what is it that this person is doing that makes them want to be so violent or physically or emotionally violent. And what is it that this person is doing when they finally react to that violence, okay? And that's what our court systems are not looking at a lot of the times when we have domestic violence cases. And that's unfortunate, I should say. There's a true life story, a movie that was made, I think, in the early 90s about a woman in the 70s or 80s. And Farrah Fawcett, if you don't know that person, look her up. She used to play one of the lead actresses in the TV series Charlie's Angels. And she starred in a movie called The Burning Bed. And it's about a woman who had domestic violence, who was a victim of domestic violence. And it went on for so long until one day she just couldn't take it anymore. And she killed her husband. And the whole case unfolds about why did she do it and how did she do it. Okay, if you want to see a really good example about domestic violence and a true life story, watch them film The Burning Bed. And that's all I have for this week about women of color and domestic violence. Talk to you later. Bye. Oh, again, if you have any questions about anything, I'm always available by email to help. Okay? Thanks. Bye-bye.